Imagine standing on a lonely Japanese shore, the sea boiling with ships, 20,000 fierce Mongol warriors charging at you, while you and your comrades number barely 80. By all logic, you should be slaughtered within minutes. But what if I told you this tiny band of samurai not only survived, but utterly humiliated the greatest war machine the world had ever seen? This isn't just a story of swords and arrows, it's a tale of strategy, honor, and the impossible clash between two civilizations. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is one of history's most unbelievable battles. The day the samurai crushed the Mongols against all odds. The shadow of the Mongol Empire. To truly understand how a handful of Japanese warriors stood against the most feared army in world history, we must first step back and look at the unstoppable force that was the Mongol Empire. By the early 13th century, the Mongols had risen from scattered nomadic tribes on the steppes of Central Asia to become the architects of the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. Their leader Genghis Khan had forged them into a war machine unlike any that had ever existed before. Ruthless discipline, revolutionary tactics, and sheer adaptability turned their cavalry into a weapon of mass destruction. City after city fell before them. The Mongols crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, burned through Persia, smashed the mighty Jin dynasty in northern China, and marched deep into Eastern Europe, defeating armies many times their size. To those who heard of their coming, the Mongols seemed less like men and more like an unstoppable plague. By the time Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan came to power in the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the edges of the Middle East. Yet for all their power, there was still one land across the sea that had not submitted: Japan. Japan before the storm. Japan in the 13th century was not a unified nation in the modern sense. It was governed by the Kamakura shogunate, a military government led by the shogun, while the emperor remained a symbolic figure. The country was fractured by rival clans, constantly testing each other's strength. Yet, in this fragmented landscape, one class rose above all others: the samurai. Unlike the Mongol horse archers, samurai fought as heavily armed individual warriors. They prized personal honor, skill with the sword, and loyalty to their lord above all else. Combat to them was not just survival, but an art, a way of proving their worth. To a Mongol general, this was strange. Battles were to be won as efficiently as possible, with minimal risk. But to the samurai, glory in single combat was everything. This cultural difference would set the stage for one of the most dramatic clashes in military history. Kublai Khan's eyes on Japan. Kublai Khan, having consolidated his control over China and proclaimed himself the founder of the Yuan dynasty, looked across the sea at Japan. In his view, the islands should pay tribute, as Korea and others had done. In 1266, he sent envoys demanding submission. The Japanese court, however, ignored him. For the samurai and their shogunate, the idea of bowing to a foreign ruler was unthinkable. Their silence infuriated Kublai. Over the next decade, he sent more envoys, each time with harsher words. Finally, by 1274, the great Khan decided he would no longer tolerate defiance. He would invade. The first Mongol invasion. In November of 1274, the Mongols launched their first assault on Japan. They assembled an army of around 20,000 soldiers, consisting not only of Mongols, but also Chinese and Korean conscripts, along with a fleet of nearly 900 ships. For the Japanese, who had never faced an external invasion on such a scale, this was an unimaginable threat. The fleet crossed the Korea Strait and landed on the small islands near Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. Their target was Hakata Bay, the key gateway into Japan's interior. When the invaders stormed ashore, the Japanese rushed to meet them. Among these defenders were bands of samurai, many of them local warriors sworn to the Hojo clan, who ruled the Kamakura shogunate at the time. The clash that followed was unlike anything Japan had ever seen. Clash of cultures on the battlefield. For centuries, Japanese warfare had been dominated by ritualized combat. A samurai might ride forward, announce his lineage, and challenge an enemy to single combat. If victorious, He would take the opponent's head as proof of his skill and honor. The Mongols, however, had no patience for such customs. They fought as a disciplined machine. Their archers unleashed volleys of arrows in coordinated waves. Their infantry pressed forward with shields and spears, and their drums thundered across the battlefield to keep their formations in sync. To the samurai, this was chaos. They charged forward individually, only to be swarmed by coordinated Mongol units. Worse still, the invaders used weapons the Japanese had never seen before: gunpowder bombs. These early explosives, hurled by catapults or by hand, burst with thunderous noise, shattering samurai morale. It seemed as though the Mongols would sweep through Hakata and carve their way into the Japanese heartland. Yet, what happened next would alter the fate of Japan forever. The defiant stand. As the Mongols pushed inland, small groups of samurai staged desperate counterattacks. Among them were warriors who refused to abandon the code of their ancestors. They rode directly into Mongol formations, cutting down enemies with the curved steel of their katanas and heavy tachi swords. Though vastly outnumbered, their ferocity shocked the invaders. Mongol armor, made of hardened leather and lamellar plates, was strong, but it was not invincible. A determined samurai strike could cut through it, and when it did, Mongol soldiers fell. One story tells of a group of only 80 samurai, mounted and armored, who launched a daring assault against thousands of Mongol troops. Their attack was not part of a grand strategy. It was sheer defiance, a refusal to yield. Against all odds, they cut down dozens of enemies, sowing confusion in the Mongol ranks. Though they could not hope to win outright, their courage bought time for more Japanese reinforcements to arrive. This, more than any weapon, was the samurai advantage, their unwavering will to fight, even in the face of impossible odds. The night and the storm. As evening fell, the Mongols, having made significant gains during the day, retreated back to their ships anchored in Hakata Bay. They intended to land again the following morning to finish what they had started. But fate had other plans. That night, a violent storm swept across the bay. Japanese sources describe it as a sudden and furious tempest, tearing through the Mongol fleet. Ships crashed into each other, splintered against rocks, or capsized in the raging waves. Thousands of soldiers drowned before they could even reach shore. When morning came, the once formidable invasion force was shattered. Survivors limped back to Korea, their fleet devastated, their confidence shaken. To the Japanese, this was nothing short of divine intervention. They came to believe that the storm had been sent by the gods themselves to protect their islands. They called it the kamikaze, the divine wind. Yet the Mongols were not finished. Kublai Khan, enraged by the failure, began preparations for an even greater invasion. And in the years that followed, Japan would face the Mongols again in an even more desperate struggle. The calm before the storm. The Mongols' first invasion of Japan in 1274 had ended in disaster. Thousands of their soldiers drowned. Their fleet lay shattered, and Japan remained unconquered. Yet the Japanese knew this was not the end. They had humiliated the Great Khan, and such an insult would never be forgotten. In the months after the invasion, the Japanese celebrated the storm that saved them. Priests and poets declared it the work of the gods, a divine wind sent to protect the sacred islands from foreign invaders. The word kamikaze, divine wind, entered their history as a sign of destiny. But beneath the celebrations, Japan's leaders were wary. They understood the truth. The Mongols had not been defeated by the sword. They had been defeated by nature. And nature could not always be relied upon. The Hojo clan, who ruled through the Kamakura shogunate, acted quickly. If the Mongols returned, Japan needed to be ready, building the wall. The first step was defense. The shogunate ordered the construction of massive stone walls along the shoreline of Hakata Bay, where the Mongols had landed. These walls, known as Genko Borui, were no small undertaking. Stretching for miles along the coast, they stood nearly 2 meters high and several meters thick, designed to prevent Mongol ships from landing troops directly onto the beaches. Behind these walls, samurai and their retainers trained and waited. The Mongols had shown the Japanese new forms of warfare, coordinated volleys of arrows, shield formations, and gunpowder weapons. Now, the samurai prepared not just to duel with single opponents, but to stand together in defense of their homeland. The memory of the 80 samurai who had ridden into impossible odds became a rallying symbol. Their courage had proven that Mongols could bleed, that sheer determination could slow even the greatest army in the world. Japan would need that spirit again. The Great Khan's wrath. Across the sea, in the court of Kublai Khan, the failure of 1274 was seen not as a setback, but as an insult. Kublai, ruler of China and much of Asia, had demanded submission from a small island nation and been ignored. When he sent an army, they had not returned victorious. His fury was immense. He blamed not only the Japanese, but also his own allies. He punished Korean officials for providing what he considered inadequate ships, and he began planning something far greater. A second invasion, larger and more decisive than the first. This time, he would not send 20,000 men. He would send over 100,000. Japan's uncertainty. In Japan, years passed with no sign of the Mongols. For the farmers and villagers, life returned to normal rhythms of planting and harvest. But the samurai and their lords lived in uneasy anticipation. At any moment, sails could appear on the horizon. The cost of maintaining readiness was enormous. Families were ordered to supply men and arms, and the shogunate strained under the burden of feeding and equipping its defenders. Unlike the Mongols, who could draw upon the wealth of China, the Japanese government had limited resources. Yet for the samurai, the prospect of another invasion was both terrifying and exhilarating. To fall in battle against overwhelming odds was the highest form of honor. Many trained with the expectation that they might soon lay down their lives in defense of their homeland. The second invasion takes shape. By 1281, Kublai Khan was ready. He ordered two massive fleets to be built. The Eastern Route Army, around 40,000 men, mostly Mongols and Koreans, sailing from the Korean peninsula. The Southern Route Army, around 100,000 men, largely Chinese conscripts and sailors, sailing from southern China. Together, these forces would converge on Japan in a colossal pincer movement. Their target once again was Kyushu, and from there, they planned to march inland and crush Japanese resistance. The scale of this invasion dwarfed the first. The fleet numbered over 4,000 ships, making it one of the largest amphibious invasions in history, centuries before the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. Japan holds its breath. As rumors of the Mongols' preparations reached Japan, fear spread across the islands. Messengers rode from village to village, warning the people to prepare for war. Monks prayed for divine protection. Samurai sharpened their swords and tightened the straps of their armor. The great stone walls of Hakata Bay stood ready, a physical reminder that this time, Japan would not be caught off guard. In the spring of 1281, the sails of the Mongol fleet appeared on the horizon once again. The invasion of Japan, the largest seaborne assault the world had ever seen, was about to begin. But before the two massive armies could unite, fate would once again intervene in ways neither the Mongols nor the Japanese could predict. The Second Mongol Invasion. The year was 1281, and the largest naval invasion the world had ever seen was on the move. Kublai Khan's fury had materialized into a fleet of more than 4,000 ships, carrying over 140,000 soldiers, sailors, and support staff. His plan was simple: overwhelm Japan with numbers, crush its samurai defenders, and bring the islands under Mongol dominion. But as vast as this force was, it faced a problem from the very beginning. Kublai's fleets were divided. The Eastern Route Army, 40,000 strong, sailed from Korea. The Southern Route Army, with nearly 100,000 men, sailed from southern China. The two were meant to unite and strike Japan together. But coordination over such distances in the 13th century was difficult. The Japanese would take advantage of this. The Eastern Army arrives. In early June 1281, the Eastern Route Army reached Hakata Bay. They had expected to storm ashore as they had in 1274. But to their shock, the beaches were no longer open ground. Instead, a massive stone wall, stretching for miles along the bay, stood in their way. The Jinko Borui, Japan's wall of defense, rose high above the surf. Mongol ships could not simply ram onto the beaches as before. Soldiers attempting to land were forced to climb down into smaller boats, exposing themselves to Japanese arrows and stones hurled from the defenders above. For days, the Mongols launched wave after wave of assaults. They tried to storm the walls with ladders, but the samurai cut them down. They attempted to bombard the shore with arrows and explosives, but the walls absorbed the attacks. Japanese defenders rained death from above, refusing to yield a single stone. Hakata Bay had become a fortress. Samurai raids by night, but the Japanese did not simply wait behind their defenses. At night, small bands of samurai rowed out to sea in little boats, slipping between the Mongol ships. Under the cover of darkness, they boarded enemy vessels, swords flashing in the moonlight. These were not large-scale attacks, but they struck terror into the Mongols. A dozen samurai might storm a ship, killing everyone on board before slipping away again. Some ships were even set aflame, their burning hulks drifting into the fleet. The Mongols, used to fighting disciplined armies in open fields, had never faced such relentless, guerrilla-style warfare. Every night was a torment of fear and uncertainty that a stalemate at Hakata. The Eastern Army found itself trapped. They could not break through the walls, and they dared not sail further inland for fear of ambush. Worse still, they had no news of the Southern Army, which was still delayed in China by storms and logistical problems. Weeks passed, and supplies began to dwindle. The Mongols were growing restless. Disease crept into their camps. All the while, the Japanese grew bolder, their confidence swelling with each failed Mongol assault. But this was only the beginning. The storm that had saved Japan once before was gathering again on the horizon. The Southern Army arrives. By July, the massive Southern Route Army finally reached Japanese waters. Their fleet, larger than anything the Japanese had ever seen, stretched across the horizon like a forest of sails. With nearly 100,000 men, they dwarfed both the Eastern Army and the defenders waiting behind Hakata's walls. When the Southern Army joined the Eastern Army, the Mongols once again possessed overwhelming strength. Now, with two great fleets combined, they prepared for a final, decisive strike against Japan. The Japanese braced for the assault. Behind their walls, samurai sharpened their blades, priests prayed for divine intervention, and peasants prepared to fight alongside their lords. The largest battle in Japanese history was about to begin. Clash at sea. The Mongols launched their attack with all their might. Ship after ship advanced on Hakata Bay, unloading men into small craft to storm the beaches. The samurai met them head-on, arrows raining down, swords flashing as they cut into the invaders. But the most brutal fighting happened not on land, but on the water itself. Japanese warbands continued their nightly raids, now against a fleet numbering thousands of ships. In desperate hand-to-hand combat, they boarded enemy vessels, striking with swords and spears. Some chose to burn the ships they captured, sending fire spreading across the bay. These raids were small compared to the size of the Mongol fleet, but they created chaos, preventing the invaders from organizing properly. The Mongols, who excelled in coordinated tactics on land, found themselves vulnerable at sea. The turning point. By August, the invasion had dragged on for weeks. The Mongols had failed to capture Hakata, despite their superior numbers. Supplies were dwindling once again. Discipline began to falter. Ships became overcrowded with sick and wounded men. Then, in mid-August, as the Mongol commanders considered regrouping for one last push, the skies began to darken. A storm was coming. At first, it was just strong winds, the kind the sailors had endured before. But soon the waves rose higher, the winds howled louder, and the heavens opened with torrential rain. The storm grew into a typhoon, a force far beyond human control. The Mongol fleet, vast though it was, had a fatal weakness. Many of its ships were hastily built, made for transport rather than open-sea combat. As the typhoon struck, ships slammed into each other, shattered against rocks, and capsized in the violent waves. The bay that had once been filled with sails was now a graveyard. The kamikaze. For 2 days, the storm raged. When it finally passed, the Mongol invasion force was utterly destroyed. Tens of thousands of soldiers drowned, their bodies washing up on Japanese shores. The survivors were hunted down by samurai patrols. The greatest naval invasion in history had ended not with Japan's conquest, but with its salvation. Once again, the Japanese called the storm the kamikaze, the divine wind sent by the gods to protect their islands. And with this second miraculous deliverance, Japan was spared from the Mongol Empire. But the story did not end here. The aftermath of the invasion would leave scars on both nations, scars that would shape their histories for centuries to come. The aftermath of the divine wind. When the Great Typhoon finally cleared in August of 1281, the once mighty Mongol invasion fleet was gone. Hakata Bay, which only days earlier had been filled with thousands of ships, was now a wreckage of shattered hulls, floating corpses, and broken dreams of conquest. The Japanese defenders, exhausted but victorious, surveyed the scene with awe. For them, the storm had been no ordinary weather. Twice now, nature had intervened in their darkest hour. Twice, the Mongols, the terror of the world, had been brought low by a wind that seemed guided by the hand of heaven. The word kamikaze, the divine wind, was etched forever into their history, hunting the survivors. Though the storm had destroyed most of the fleet, thousands of Mongol soldiers still washed ashore, clinging to wreckage or staggering out of the waves. For the samurai, this was not the time for mercy. Bands of warriors roamed the coastlines, cutting down survivors where they found them. Samurai considered the Mongols a brutal enemy who had desecrated their land with fire and blood. Many survivors were executed on the spot, their heads taken as trophies of victory. Others were rounded up and killed systematically. A few were spared, usually to be enslaved or interrogated. Korean and Chinese conscripts, in particular, were sometimes spared, as the Japanese recognized they had been forced into Mongol service. But the fate of the Mongols themselves was grim. The coastlines of Kyushu became a killing ground where the last remnants of Kublai Khan's army were wiped out. A nation saved. In the temples of Japan, monks and priests led ceremonies of thanksgiving. They declared that the gods had chosen to protect their sacred islands from foreign domination. The people believed wholeheartedly. The idea of Japan as a land shielded by divine favor became central to its national identity. For the samurai, the victory was a validation of their courage. Though outnumbered and facing terrifying new weapons, they had stood their ground. The walls of Hakata Bay, their daring night raids, and above all their unyielding spirit had bought the time necessary for the storm to do its work. Yet beneath the celebration, there was unease. The war had nearly bankrupted the shogunate. The construction of walls, the constant mobilization of samurai, and the loss of farmland during the fighting had strained Japan's economy. Unlike in conquest-driven wars, there was no land to distribute, no treasure to divide. Samurai expected rewards for their service, but the government had little to give. The seeds of discontent were being sown. The cost to the Mongols. For the Mongol Empire, the loss was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of men, perhaps more than half the invasion force, had perished. The fleet, one of the largest ever assembled, was annihilated. The cost in ships, materials, and manpower was staggering. Kublai Khan was furious. His dream of conquering Japan had been thwarted not once, but twice. Yet even in his rage, he recognized the logistical nightmare of mounting a third invasion. China itself was restless, with rebellions breaking out against Mongol rule. To launch another assault across the sea would stretch his empire to the breaking point. Still, Kublai could not admit defeat. He continued to send envoys demanding Japan's submission, but the Japanese ignored him. In time, the Mongols turned their focus elsewhere, leaving Japan unconquered. The legacy of the kamikaze, the failure of the Mongol invasions, had consequences far beyond the battlefield. For Japan, it reinforced the belief in their uniqueness, that they were a nation protected by the gods themselves. This idea would echo through centuries of history, re-emerging in later eras whenever Japan faced foreign threats. For the samurai, the invasions were a defining moment. They had stood against impossible odds and survived. Their way of war, their loyalty, and their willingness to sacrifice became legendary. Stories of the 80 samurai who had charged into Mongol ranks lived on as symbols of courage, inspiring generations of warriors to come. Yet the invasions also exposed cracks within Japanese society. The immense cost of defense had weakened the shogunate, while the inability to properly reward the samurai sowed seeds of unrest that would eventually destabilize the Kamakura government. Victory came at a price, one that Japan would pay in the years ahead. The Mongols learned limits. For the Mongols, the failure in Japan was a rare humiliation. This was the empire that had crushed China, Persia, and much of Europe. Yet twice, against a small island nation, they had been defeated, not by superior armies, but by a combination of stubborn defenders and the fury of the sea. It revealed a fundamental weakness in Mongol strategy. On land, their cavalry was unmatched, but at sea, they were vulnerable. The logistics of maintaining massive fleets across stormy waters proved disastrous. In time, the Mongols would abandon hopes of maritime conquest and focus instead on solidifying their control over the continent. A world in awe, news of the Mongols' defeat spread far and wide. Across Asia, kingdoms that had feared the Mongols for decades saw hope in Japan's survival. If the Great Khan could fail, perhaps his empire was not invincible after all. Japan became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the strongest power in the world could be brought low. In Europe, where memories of Mongol raids still haunted the people, tales of the divine wind reached travelers and merchants. Some saw it as proof that the Mongols were mortal. Others saw it as a distant miracle, an act of God punishing arrogance. For Japan itself, the victory became mythologized, passed down through generations as one of the proudest moments in their history. The divine wind was not just a storm, it was destiny, the samurai's burden. But for the samurai, daily life after the invasion was less glorious. Many had risked everything, lost family and wealth, and returned to find little compensation. The shogunate, stretched thin, could not reward them adequately. Discontent grew among the warrior class, who felt their sacrifices had not been honored. This simmering dissatisfaction would, in time, weaken the Kamakura shogunate, opening the way for new powers to rise in Japan. The shadow of the Mongol invasions hung over the nation not just as a triumph, but as a reminder of the costs of survival. The divine wind had saved Japan, but the storm of internal struggle was just beginning. The turning point: samurai brilliance and Mongol overconfidence. The night after the initial coastal ambush was one of eerie silence. The Mongol fleet anchored offshore, burned torches that glittered like stars on the water. To the samurai on land, it was as if a second galaxy had descended upon the sea. 80 warriors faced the ominous glow of hundreds of ships, carrying tens of thousands of hardened Mongol troops. And yet, rather than being paralyzed by fear, these samurai spent the night meditating, sharpening their blades, and whispering prayers to the kami, the Shinto spirits of war and protection. By dawn, the Mongol commanders were restless. They had expected the Japanese to scatter after the first skirmishes. Instead, they found their ships harassed, their supply lines disrupted, and their soldiers demoralized by constant losses to an invisible, elusive enemy. Still, they were confident. After all, they outnumbered the defenders by several hundred to one. What could 80 warriors truly achieve? That arrogance would cost them dearly. Samurai guerrilla tactics on the shore. On the morning of the fifth day, the Mongols prepared for a full landing. They wanted to overwhelm the small Japanese forces in one decisive strike. But when their boats hit the shoreline, the samurai unleashed a terrifying display of precision. Instead of meeting the Mongols in open combat, the Japanese defenders used the terrain to their advantage. Narrow coves and rocky shores funneled the landing parties into tight clusters. Hidden samurai archers, stationed on higher ground, released volleys of arrows that rained death upon the exposed Mongols. Those who made it to shore found themselves facing not large battle formations, but sudden, unpredictable attacks from small groups of samurai charging with swords and naginata. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its psychological effect. Mongol soldiers were trained for massed formations, tight discipline, and overwhelming numbers. Facing a swarm of elusive, highly skilled individuals who attacked with precision and vanished into the terrain shattered their confidence. To the Mongols, it seemed as if the very island itself resisted them. The suicide raids. But perhaps the most daring tactic employed by the samurai were the infamous night raids. Under cover of darkness, small boats of Japanese warriors rowed silently toward the anchored Mongol fleet. Armed with grappling hooks, they clambered aboard enemy ships, cutting down sleeping soldiers in a frenzy of violence before setting fire to the vessels. These raids were brutal and costly. Many samurai never returned, overwhelmed by sheer numbers or consumed by flames. But every ship destroyed, every supply lost, and every soldier killed sent ripples of fear through the Mongol ranks. The Mongol commanders could not comprehend this type of warfare. In their campaigns across China, Korea, and Central Asia, they had faced massive armies and sprawling cities. But here, they were confronted not by armies, but by shadows, warriors who seemed to fight with the ferocity of demons, unafraid of death, and committed to defending their homeland at any cost. Mongol frustration and the weight of numbers. Despite these setbacks, numbers still favored the Mongols. Each raid, each ambush, each skirmish took a toll on the Japanese defenders. Exhaustion weighed heavily on the 80 samurai. Their armor was dented, their swords dulled, and their bodies bruised. The Mongols adjusted their strategies. They began constructing makeshift fortifications near the shore, securing their landing sites with barricades to prevent further ambushes. They stationed more guards aboard their ships at night to counter the raids. Slowly, the balance of attrition began to tilt. Yet, even with tens of thousands of soldiers at their command, the Mongol generals faced an unforeseen challenge: morale. The longer the campaign dragged on without a decisive victory, the more restless their troops became. Supplies were running thin, storms threatened the fleet, and whispers of bad omens spread like wildfire. Some soldiers muttered that the gods of Japan themselves were against them. The samurai's spiritual resolve. Back on land, the 80 defenders continued to fight, not just with skill, but with spiritual conviction. Every arrow loosed, every sword strike, every ambush was accompanied by the belief that they were enacting the will of the kami. Defeat was not an option, not because they believed they could physically annihilate 20,000 invaders, but because surrender would dishonor their ancestors, their lords, and their nation. To the samurai, death in battle was not the end, but the ultimate fulfillment of duty. This mindset gave them a resilience that bewildered the Mongols. Where other armies might have broken under pressure, the samurai fought harder the more desperate the situation became. A clash of cultures. The conflict between the 80 samurai and the Mongol invaders was more than a military struggle. It was a clash of worldviews. The Mongols represented empire, expansion, and overwhelming might. Their warfare relied on psychological shock, superior numbers, and mobile cavalry formations. They saw Japan as just another conquest, a stepping stone in their empire's eastward expansion. The samurai, by contrast, embodied loyalty, honor, and individual valor. Their code of Bushido emphasized personal courage and the willingness to sacrifice oneself for one's lord and land. Even in the face of annihilation, they clung to the belief that one warrior's spirit could tip the scales of battle. This cultural divide meant that every skirmish was not just about territory, but about proving the superiority of one way of life over another. The seeds of Mongol retreat. By the end of this phase of the campaign, the Mongols had suffered significant losses, not in the sense of absolute numbers, but in spirit and strategy. Hundreds of soldiers had died in raids and ambushes. Dozens of ships had been destroyed. Supplies were dwindling. And most importantly, the myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered. For the first time in their eastern campaigns, the Mongols encountered an enemy that did not break, did not submit, and did not yield ground easily. Instead, They found themselves locked in a war of attrition against warriors who seemed to draw strength from every setback. The stage was set for one of history's greatest turning points. The Mongols, who had swept across continents with unstoppable momentum, were beginning to falter on the shores of Japan. And at the heart of this resistance were 80 samurai, whose courage and brilliance defied the odds in ways the world had never seen before. The Mongol retaliation and the samurai's last stand. As the first light of dawn spilled across the waves, the Mongols, still shaken from the night's ambush, regrouped on their ships. Their commanders barked orders in Mongolian, Turkic, and Chinese dialects, trying to rally the fractured morale of their soldiers. Overnight, they had lost not only hundreds of men, but also a sense of invincibility. For the first time, an enemy force, drastically outnumbered, had humiliated them with cunning, speed, and sheer audacity. But the Mongols were nothing if not relentless. Their commanders refused to let the Japanese escape unpunished. By mid-morning, gongs and horns sounded from the ships, signaling a counterattack. Hundreds of small craft filled with Mongol archers, spearmen, and swordsmen began rowing toward the shore, determined to crush the samurai once and for all. On the beaches of Hakata Bay, the surviving 80 samurai, now weary but unbroken, gathered their strength. Many bore wounds, slashes across their arms, arrows lodged in their armor, and bruises from clashes with Mongol maces. Yet not one considered retreat. Their ethos, the Bushido Code, demanded resistance until death. To them, this was no longer about victory or survival. It was about honor. The Mongol tide, the Mongol counterattack, came like a storm. Their war drums pounded in unison, echoing across the waters like thunder. Waves of ships advanced, their soldiers unleashing volleys of arrows that darkened the skies. The samurai raised their lacquered shields and crouched low, the clattering of arrows against their armor, sounding like heavy rain. Yet despite the sheer numbers, the Mongols faced a problem. They were trained to fight in open terrain, using cavalry to encircle and overwhelm enemies. Here, on the beaches of Japan, their cavalry was useless, their horses still stranded aboard ships. Forced into tight, narrow formations, they were at a disadvantage. The terrain favored the samurai, who were accustomed to hand-to-hand combat in rugged landscapes. As the first wave of Mongols landed, the samurai charged with terrifying ferocity. Their war cries pierced the roar of battle as they slammed into the invaders with katanas, naginatas, and short stabbing swords. One samurai, bleeding from a shoulder wound, cut down 3 Mongols in quick succession before being felled by a spear. Another leaped directly into the enemy formation, swinging his blade with such speed that he created a momentary gap, allowing his comrades to strike. The Mongols fought back with ruthless efficiency. Their shields interlocked, their spearmen thrust in coordinated rhythm, and their archers fired at close range. The clash was brutal, each side pouring every ounce of strength into survival. Samurai tactics, fighting like shadows. Despite the Mongols' numbers, the samurai's tactics continued to sow chaos. Instead of fighting in rigid formations, the Japanese warriors moved fluidly, striking at vulnerable points before darting away. They exploited the invaders' reliance on mass coordination by breaking their rhythm. Small groups of samurai deliberately targeted Mongol officers, creating confusion within the enemy ranks. Others feigned retreats, luring Mongols into overextending before turning to strike with precision. Even as their bodies weakened, the warriors' discipline and training shone. The Mongols, though disciplined, were unused to such unpredictable tactics. They were accustomed to facing enemies who either surrendered quickly or collapsed under cavalry charges. Here, every inch of ground was contested. Every samurai seemed to fight with the strength of 10. One account speaks of a lone samurai who, having lost his sword, wrestled a Mongol warrior to the ground, ripped the dagger from his enemy's belt, and used it to continue fighting. Another is said to have tied his wounds with strips of cloth torn from his own armor, refusing to retreat until his final breath. The breaking point. Hours passed, and the battle raged on. Corpses of both Mongols and samurai littered the sand, staining it crimson. The waves lapped to the shore, carrying away fragments of broken armor and shattered weapons. The Mongols began to encircle what remained of the Japanese warriors, pushing them back toward a rocky outcrop. By now, fewer than 40 samurai still stood. Exhausted, wounded, and drenched in sweat, they looked upon one another with silent resolve. They knew their fate, yet their spirits did not falter. To them, death in battle was the highest honor, and dying against overwhelming odds would immortalize their names. The Mongols pressed in tighter, their numbers overwhelming. Shields closed around the samurai, spears thrust from all sides. One by one, the Japanese warriors fell, but not before dragging more enemies down with them. The beach echoed with the clashing of steel and the cries of the dying. As the last samurai prepared for his final stand, he is said to have shouted a battle cry invoking his ancestors and the protection of the kami, the spirits of Shinto belief. With his remaining strength, he charged into the horde, cutting down 3 Mongols before finally succumbing beneath a storm of blades. The Mongols' hollow victory. When silence finally fell over the beach, the Mongols stood victorious, but it was a hollow victory. Nearly half of their landing force had been wiped out by fewer than 80 men. The sand was soaked with blood, and their soldiers, once confident and unyielding, now whispered of omens and curses. To them, these samurai were not mere men. They were demons, spirits of war that refused to yield. Superstitious whispers spread quickly across the fleet. Some claimed the Japanese were protected by the gods themselves. Others murmured that the land of Japan was cursed, a place where even the bravest Mongol could fall. That day, the Mongols learned a lesson that would haunt them for years. Numbers alone could not guarantee victory. They had crushed empires across Asia, from Persia to Russia, but on the shores of Japan, a handful of warriors had inflicted wounds not only to their army, but also to their pride. The calm before the storm. Though the samurai had been annihilated, their sacrifice was not in vain. News of their stand spread across Kyushu, inspiring other warriors to prepare for battle. The Mongols may have won this skirmish, but the psychological toll was immense. Their confidence was shaken, their strategy questioned, and their aura of invincibility tarnished. Unbeknownst to them, the true disaster had not yet struck. For while the Mongols celebrated their grim victory on the beaches, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The seas began to stir, winds picked up, and the first whispers of a typhoon rippled across the waves. The gods of Japan, it seemed, were not yet finished with the invaders. Legacy of Tsushima and outro. The sun set on the island of Tsushima in the aftermath of carnage. The shores painted with the wreckage of ships and the lifeless forms of warriors who had once believed themselves invincible. For Japan, the day was not merely a battlefield victory. It was the solidification of a national myth, a tale of divine intervention, and a turning point that would shape the country's sense of identity for centuries. The Mongols, so accustomed to triumph after triumph, had been humbled not once, but twice. They had hurled tens of thousands of men, the might of the Yuan dynasty, and the resources of Korea and China into the seas around Japan, only to find themselves shattered by storms, by resistance, and by the unyielding spirit of the samurai. But what made the final clash so remarkable wasn't just the typhoon that swept across the bay, nor the burning of the ships. It was the courage of those 80 men at Hirado who, against impossible odds, dared to fight 20,000 invaders. Their sacrifice bought time, broke momentum, and sent a ripple of panic through an army that should have been unstoppable. The psychological victory. In warfare, numbers often dominate the narrative. 20,000 Mongols should have brushed aside 80 defenders without effort. And yet, the lesson of Tsushima was that psychology, the will to fight, the ability to exploit fear, was just as decisive as blades and arrows. The Mongols had been trained for battlefield discipline, but they were not accustomed to prolonged resistance from smaller forces. When the samurai fought as if they were an army of thousands, cutting down every man who came ashore, it sowed uncertainty. Was this an ambush? Was the Japanese army larger than it appeared? Did the island itself have reinforcements waiting? Fear, once it enters an army's heart, spreads faster than fire. And by the time the Mongols realized the truth, that they vastly outnumbered their opponents, their command structure had already been shaken by disorder. The samurai had bought something even more valuable than lives. They had bought confusion, the divine wind, myth and reality. And then came the storm. The typhoon that scattered the Mongol fleet has been remembered ever since as the kamikaze, the divine wind. To the Japanese, this was no ordinary weather. It was divine intervention, the hand of the gods striking down the invaders to protect their homeland. But historians, looking back, see more than myth. The Mongol fleet had been poorly constructed. Many of the vessels were hastily built riverboats, never intended for the open seas. The typhoon exposed this fatal weakness, smashing apart their hulls, overturning their decks, and grinding them against the rocky coastline of Kyushu. Nature and human courage had converged. Without the resistance of the samurai, the Mongols might have secured stronger footholds before the storm. Without the storm, the resistance of 80 men might have been remembered as nothing more than a heroic last stand. Together, they created a legend that reshaped history. Aftermath for the Mongols. For Kublai Khan, the defeat was both humiliating and costly. Two massive invasions had consumed enormous resources, ships, manpower, and political will. Korea and China had been drained to fuel his ambition of conquering Japan, only for the project to end in disaster. Tens of thousands of Mongol, Korean, and Chinese soldiers were lost, their bodies claimed by the sea. Survivors who washed ashore were executed by Japanese defenders, a grim reminder that mercy was not a feature of medieval warfare. Kublai considered a third invasion, but logistical nightmares, domestic unrest, and the memory of two crushing failures ensured that Japan would never again face the full weight of Mongol arms. The dream of turning Japan into a vassal state vanished beneath the waves. Japan's transformation. The victory at Tsushima did not come without cost. Japan's economy had been strained to the breaking point to fund defenses, walls, fortifications, weapons, and mobilization. Farmers had abandoned fields to build stone ramparts, and lords had drained their coffers to arm their men. Yet, paradoxically, the hardships of the invasions united the country. For centuries afterward, the image of the samurai standing against impossible odds became more than a story. It became a code, a reminder of duty, honor, and sacrifice. The tale of the divine wind strengthened the authority of the shogunate, and the belief that Japan was a land favored by the gods became ingrained in its cultural identity. Even centuries later in World War II, Japanese pilots would invoke the word kamikaze as they flung themselves into battle, echoing the winds that had once saved their ancestors. The resonance of Tsushima had stretched across ages, binding past to present. The legacy of the 80 samurai. But what of the 80? Their names are not recorded in the annals of history. They were not lords, nor famous generals, nor rulers. They were simply warriors who took up arms to defend their homeland, knowing that their chances of survival were almost non-existent. And yet, their stand ensured that their sacrifice would echo louder than their names ever could. In the face of overwhelming numbers, they demonstrated that courage and resolve could turn the tide of history. They became eternal symbols of resistance, the men who destroyed 20,000 Mongols, not through brute strength, but through defiance that inspired nature itself to intervene. Outro, the greatest battle that wasn't meant to be. So, how did 80 samurai destroy 20,000 Mongols? The answer lies not in swords alone, nor in storms alone, but in the synergy of human will and the fury of nature. The samurai fought with a desperation that transcended numbers. The Mongols faltered in the face of unexpected resistance, and the divine wind finished what courage had begun. In the end, this was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the story of Japan. It was the moment when the land of the rising sun stood unbroken against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. History has many great battles, but few are remembered with such reverence, myth, and awe as Tsushima. For in that clash, 80 warriors carved themselves into legend, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by armies, but by the unyielding spirit of a few. And that is how history's greatest battle was fought, not merely on the shores of an island, but in the hearts of those who refused to surrender.